It started on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the air felt thick and damp, and the campus sidewalks shimmered with puddles. I was in the library, buried in the far corner of the upper floor, where the oldest books were kept. My research project had taken me deep into topics most people wouldn't consider relevant: esoteric rituals, forgotten cultural practices, obscure languages. It wasn't exactly exciting work, but I found comfort in the quiet of the stacks, the faint mustiness of paper, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. That day, though, I wasn't alone. I had noticed him earlier, a man who seemed out of place, not a student or even a professor, judging by his unkempt clothes and the way he lingered without touching anything. He drifted through the aisles like a shadow, never making a sound. Occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of his face peeking between shelves, pale and slightly gaunt, with dark eyes that seemed to watch me too closely. It made me uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. Libraries attracted all kinds of people. I had been flipping through a brittle, annotated copy of an anthropological study from the 1940s when I realized I needed a different volume. One of the footnotes referenced a rare manuscript kept in the special collections, which were housed in the oldest part of the library. The stairs creaked as I descended, and the air seemed to cool the farther down I went. When I reached the heavy oak door leading to the special collections, I hesitated. There was a faint sound, something between a whisper and the rustling of fabric, coming from behind me. I turned, but the hallway was empty. Still, the unease from earlier hadn't left me. Inside the special collections room, the atmosphere shifted. The space felt older, the walls lined with dark wood paneling and shelves that climbed impossibly high. The lights were dimmer here, casting long shadows that pooled around the ornate tables and chairs scattered throughout. I found the manuscript I needed tucked into an alcove near the back. Its leather binding was cracked with age, and the title embossed on the spine was in a language I didn't recognize. I ran my fingers over the strange letters, their sharp angles and looping curves almost hypnotic. I decided to take a closer look. That's when I saw the door. At first I thought it was just a panel in the wall, one of many decorative features in the room, but something about it caught my attention. The grain of the wood didn't match the rest of the paneling, and there was a faint outline where it met the wall, as if it had been hastily concealed. I set the manuscript down and stepped closer, my curiosity overriding any sense of caution. There was no handle, but as I pressed my palm against the surface, the door gave way with a low groan. The space beyond was dark. I hesitated, looking back to see if anyone else had noticed, but the room was empty. My fingers fumbled for my phone, and I turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a narrow passageway, the walls lined with uneven bricks that gleamed faintly as if they had been polished by countless hands. The air smelled damp and faintly metallic, and a chill ran through me as I stepped inside. The passage led to a small room. Its walls were lined with shelves, but these weren't like the orderly stacks in the library. The books here were crammed together haphazardly, some stacked on top of each other, others leaning precariously as if they might topple at any moment. The bindings were worn, the titles scrawled in the same indecipherable script as the manuscript I'd found earlier. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a flickering light that seemed to distort the shadows. I ran my hand along one of the shelves, the rough spines of the book sending a shiver up my arm. I pulled one out at random and opened it. The pages were filled with densely packed text, the strange symbols flowing across the paper in an almost musical rhythm. Interspersed among the text were illustrations grotesque, hand-drawn images of figures twisted into impossible shapes, their faces obscured by swirling patterns or blank voids where eyes and mouths should have been. One illustration made my stomach turn. It depicted a room eerily similar to the one I was standing in, the shelves rendered in painstaking detail. But in the drawing there was a figure standing in the center of the room, its body elongated and bent as if it had been stretched. I slammed the book shut and returned it to the shelf, my heart pounding. As I turned to leave, I noticed another book lying open on the table in the center of the room. I hadn't seen it when I first entered. Its pages were blank, but the corners were smudged, as if someone had been handling it recently. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching the paper. It was cool, almost clammy, and I quickly pulled my hand back. A noise echoed from the passage behind me. It was faint, like the scrape of a shoe against stone. My flashlight flickered, and I turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. The passage was empty, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. It felt as if the walls were closing in, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I stepped back into the passage, moving quickly now, the beam of my flashlight shaking as my hands trembled. When I emerged into the main library, the door swung shut behind me with a soft thud. I turned to look at it, but it was gone. The wall was seamless, as if the door had never existed. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Even as I worked in the more familiar parts of the library, surrounded by other students, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. When I finally left that evening, the rain had stopped, but the campus seemed unnaturally quiet. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their glow distorted by the lingering mist. I glanced over my shoulder more than once on my walk back to my apartment. I told myself not to think about the room, to let it go, but the image of that open book and its blank pages lingered in my mind. That night, I dreamed of the passageway, the narrow bricks pressing in on me, the shelves with their grotesque illustrations. In the dream, I reached for a book, but before I could open it, a hand shot out from the shadows and grabbed my wrist. I woke up gasping, my pulse racing, the sensation of cold fingers still vivid on my skin. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't go back, but by the afternoon, my resolve had crumbled. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I found myself retracing my steps to the special collections room. The door was there again, as if mocking my earlier attempt to forget. I hesitated for a long moment before pressing my palm against it. Once again, it gave way with a groan, revealing the same dark passage. The room was just as I had left it, or so I thought. As I stepped inside, I noticed subtle differences. The books were rearranged, their chaotic order shifted into something even more disjointed. The bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered more erratically, casting shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. And on the table, another book lay open. This one wasn't blank. It was filled with the same disturbing illustrations, but now there was something new, a series of symbols scrawled around the edges of the page, almost like a border. They seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and as I stared at them, I felt a strange pressure in my temples, a low hum that grew louder the longer I looked. I snapped the book shut and stepped away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement among the shelves. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was nothing there. The air seemed colder now, each breath visible as a faint mist. I stumbled back into the passage, desperate to leave, but as I reached the end, I realized something was wrong. The door to the library was gone, replaced by another shelf filled with books. The passage stretched on, its walls narrowing, the light from my flashlight dimming, as if the batteries were draining. I turned back, hoping to find the room again, but the way had changed. The bricks seemed to shift before my eyes, the angles bending in ways that didn't make sense. Panic set in and I ran. My footsteps echoed in the confined space, the sound overlapping in strange, disorienting ways. The hum from the book was back, louder now, reverberating in my skull. It felt as though the walls were pulsing, alive with some unseen force. I stumbled to a stop, clutching my head as the sound reached a deafening crescendo. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. I leaned against the wall, struggling to catch my breath. The brick beneath my hand was unnaturally warm, pulsing faintly, as if the entire structure were alive. My flashlight had gone completely dark, leaving me in near-total blackness. The faintest glimmer of light, cold and distant, spilled from somewhere deeper in the passage. I had no choice but to move toward it. The floor felt uneven beneath my feet, the stones worn smooth in some places, jagged in others. The faint light grew stronger as I stumbled forward, revealing the end of the passage and an archway carved into the stone. The doorway led to another room, larger than the one I'd first entered. Shelves stretched impossibly high, disappearing into shadows above. These books were older, the bindings cracked and crumbling, some leaking thin streams of dust, as if the pages were disintegrating from within. A massive table sat at the center of the room, its surface cluttered with loose pages, inkwells, and quills, tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in centuries. At first I thought the room was empty. Then I saw it. In the far corner, huddled between two towering shelves, was a figure. It was still, crouched low to the ground, its back to me. The flickering light in the room cast its shadow across the wall, but something was wrong with the proportions. The shadow twisted and warped unnaturally, its movements subtle but unmistakable. "Hello," my voice echoed, thin and fragile. The figure didn't respond. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Something about the figure felt familiar. The slope of its shoulders, the way it hunched it reminded me of someone I'd seen before, but I couldn't place where. As I took a cautious step closer, the figure shifted. Its head tilted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its profile. My breath hitched. It was me. Not an exact replica, but close enough to make my skin crawl. The eyes were sunken, the cheeks hollow, the skin pale and stretched too tightly over the bones. It didn't look at me directly, but the way its head tilted further, listening, made it clear that it was aware of my presence. I backed away, my foot catching on the uneven floor. The sound of my stumble broke the tension, and the figure moved. Its head snapped toward me, and for the first time, I saw its face fully. The features were wrong off-center, as if someone had tried to reconstruct a memory of me, but had gotten the details slightly wrong. Its mouth opened, but instead of a scream or a word, there was a low, guttural rasp. I turned and ran. The passage had shifted again. The bricks seemed to fold inward, forming narrow, twisting corridors that forced me to crouch and crawl. The walls felt alive, the damp stone pulsing beneath my hands. Behind me, I could hear its scraping footsteps, the rasping sound growing louder. The thing was following me. I reached a dead end. The wall in front of me was smooth, featureless stone. I slammed my fists against it, desperate for a way out. The sound of the footsteps grew closer, and I turned, pressing my back to the wall. The passage behind me was empty, but the oppressive air made it clear I wasn't alone. The rasping sound stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, the bricks behind me gave way, crumbling into a dark void. Hands cold, skeletal, and impossibly strong grabbed my shoulders, pulling me backward. I screamed as I fell into the darkness, my body tumbling through an endless void. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the library. The special collections room was empty, the shelves neat and orderly. The hidden door was gone. For a moment I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I noticed the book on the table. It was open to a new page. This time the illustration was of me. I was standing in the room, my flashlight in hand, my face twisted in terror. Behind me, the shadow of the figure loomed, its grotesque shape reaching toward me. I slammed the book shut and stumbled out of the room, my legs barely carrying me. As I passed through the main library, I noticed the man from before, the one who had been watching me. He was sitting at a table, his pale face expressionless as he followed me with his dark eyes. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I told myself I wouldn't go back. But that night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the book haunted me. The figure, the shadows, the room, I couldn't get it out of my head. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The illustration in the book, the clothes I had been wearing, the position of my flashlight, it was exactly how I had looked when I entered the hidden room that second time. The book hadn't been showing the past, it had been showing the future. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. That book, whatever it was, hadn't just been depicting something random. It had seen me, recorded me, and worse, anticipated me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the minutes ticked by. Each sound in my apartment seemed amplified: the creak of the building settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. I thought about the illustration, the grotesque figure looming behind me, and a chilling thought rooted itself in my mind: had it been there all along? Had I simply not noticed it? Sleep eventually came, but it was restless and fractured. I dreamed of twisting corridors, of books with blank pages that filled themselves as I watched. The grotesque figure followed me through every dream, its shadow stretching across walls that seemed to bend and ripple like water. When I woke, the unease hadn't faded. The morning sunlight spilling through my window did little to dispel the lingering dread. I tried to go about my day attending classes, burying myself in research, but my thoughts kept circling back to the hidden room and its shifting contents. By the afternoon, my resolve broke. I needed to know more. Whether it was fear or curiosity driving me, I couldn't say, but by the time the sun began to set, I found myself walking back to the library. The building was quieter than usual, the hushed murmurs of students and the rustle of pages somehow more subdued. I climbed the stairs to the special collections room, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the stillness. When I reached the heavy oak door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle, and for a moment I considered turning back, but the pull was too strong. The room was just as I had left it, its air carrying the same faint scent of old paper and dust. I scanned the shelves, half expecting the hidden door to be gone again, but it was there. My heart pounded as I approached it, the faint outline almost mocking me with its presence. I pressed my hand against the wood, and the door swung open. The passage was darker this time, the air colder. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom as I made my way forward. The sense of wrongness was stronger, as if the very space around me had become aware of my intrusion. When I reached the room, I immediately noticed the changes. The shelves were more chaotic, the books spilling onto the floor in untidy heaps. Pages had been torn out and scattered, their strange symbols and grotesque illustrations now smeared with what looked like dark stains. The bulb overhead flickered erratically, casting sharp, stuttering shadows that seemed to dance on their own. At the center of the room, the table was gone. In its place was a large, circular symbol etched into the stone floor. It looked freshly carved, the grooves deep and jagged. The edges of the symbol were lined with the same shimmering script I'd seen in the books, and as I stepped closer, the faint hum returned, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I shouldn't have gone closer, but I did. Something about the symbol drew me in, the shimmering script almost hypnotic. I crouched beside it, running my fingers over the grooves. The stone felt warm, almost alive, and as I touched it, the hum grew louder. The room seemed to darken, the light from the bulb above dimming until it was little more than a weak glow. The shadows around me thickened, shifting and writhing like living things. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I thought I might have imagined it. It came again. Louder this time, a low, guttural voice speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping to the floor with a clatter. The voice grew louder, joined by others, a chorus of guttural whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The shadows converged on the symbol, swirling together into a dense, roiling mass. My body froze as I watched the darkness coalesce, taking shape. A figure emerged, its form tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and angular. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank void, smooth and featureless. Yet I felt its gaze, a heavy, suffocating presence that pinned me in place. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The figure took a step toward me, its movements unnaturally fluid, almost serpentine. My legs finally obeyed me, and I scrambled backward, grabbing my flashlight and shining it at the thing. The beam hit its form, but instead of recoiling, it seemed to absorb the light, its shadow growing darker and more defined. It raised one of its hands-long, spindly fingers tipped with sharp points and gestured toward the shelves. I followed its motion, my eyes landing on one book that stood out from the rest. It was pristine, its leather binding unblemished, its title embossed in gold lettering that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The letters shifted as I stared at them, rearranging themselves into words I could understand. Take it. Read it. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, but the pressure of its gaze was unbearable. Trembling, I reached for the book, my fingers brushing the cool leather. As soon as I picked it up, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The pages were blank at first, but as I flipped through them, words and images began to appear. They weren't written, they were forming, almost growing, like ink bleeding through the paper. The illustrations were the same grotesque style as before, but this time they were moving. Figures twisted and writhed on the pages, their mouths opening in silent screams. And then I saw myself. The illustration was unmistakable. I was standing in the same room, the book in my hands, my face frozen in terror. Behind me, the featureless figure loomed, its hand reaching for my shoulder. I dropped the book and turned, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint hum of the symbol etched into the floor. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, the passage shifting around me as I stumbled blindly forward. The bricks seemed to twist and fold, the walls closing in until I thought I would be crushed. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I burst through the hidden door and into the special collections room. The door slammed shut behind me, and when I turned, it was gone. The library was silent. Everything looked normal, but I knew it wasn't. The weight of the room, the oppressive air, it felt as though the entire building was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air burning my lungs. I thought that would be the end of it. But when I got home, I found the book waiting for me on my desk. The sight of the book on my desk stopped me cold. My apartment door was locked, the windows shut. I hadn't brought the book with me, there was no way I could have. Yet there it was, its leather binding pristine, its title glimmering faintly in the dim light of the room. My instinct was to run, to leave the book untouched, but something deeper, darker, rooted me in place. I stepped closer, every nerve in my body screaming in protest. My hands trembled as I reached out, brushing the cool surface of the cover. The instant my fingers touched it, a wave of nausea rolled over me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to ripple like a distorted reflection in water. When the sensation passed, I found myself sitting at my desk, the book open in front of me. Its pages were no longer blank. The illustrations were more vivid now, the grotesque figures rendered in sickening detail. They twisted and writhed as if alive, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. The text alongside them flowed like a living thing, the letters rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed to shift just out of comprehension. The more I stared, the more the symbols burned into my mind, their meaning teasing the edge of understanding. The final illustration stopped me cold. It was me again. I was sitting at my desk, the book open before me, my face pale and terrified. Behind me, the shadowed figure loomed, its spindly hand reaching toward my neck. I spun around in my chair, but the room was empty. Still, I felt that suffocating presence, the weight of unseen eyes. I slammed the book shut and shoved it into a drawer, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My skin prickled as if I were being watched, every shadow in the room seeming deeper, more alive. I turned on every light in the apartment, but it didn't help. The shadows were still there, shifting at the edges of my vision. That night, I didn't sleep. The whispers began just after midnight. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves outside my window, but as the hours passed, they grew louder, more distinct. Low, guttural voices speaking in that same incomprehensible language, their tones rising and falling in an almost rhythmic chant. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room until I thought I would lose my mind. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside me, vibrating in my chest, resonating in my skull. I stumbled out of bed, my movements clumsy and disoriented, and threw open the drawer where I'd hidden the book. It was gone. In its place was a single page, torn and yellowed, the edges curling as if it had been burned. The symbols on the page were different this time, more chaotic, almost frantic in their arrangement. At the center was a single illustration. It showed a door, cracked open to reveal the darkness beyond. My breath hitched as I realized it was my front door. A knock echoed through the apartment. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic knock of a neighbor or a delivery person. It was slow, deliberate, each thud reverberating through the room like a hammer striking wood. I froze, staring at the door, the air around me thick and suffocating. The knock came again, louder this time. I wanted to move, to hide, to do anything but stand there like prey waiting to be caught. But my body wouldn't obey. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. The door creaked open, though I hadn't touched it. Beyond it was darkness, not the dim, familiar darkness of a poorly lit hallway, but a deep, consuming void that seemed to stretch forever. And in that void something moved. The figure stepped forward, its elongated limbs bending at unnatural angles, its featureless face somehow more horrifying in the faint light spilling from my apartment. It didn't speak, but the whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. My vision blurred, the room spinning as if the world itself were unraveling. I stumbled backward, my body shaking uncontrollably. The figure raised one of its hands, pointing directly at me. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and impossibly final. Then everything went dark. When I woke, I was back in the library. I was seated at one of the tables, the book open before me. The library was empty, eerily silent, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears and makes you question if you're alone. The pages of the book were blank again, but the cover was different. It bore my name. I closed the book and stood, my movements sluggish and disoriented. The air in the library felt wrong, heavier than it should have been, and as I glanced around, I realized the shelves had shifted. The orderly rows were gone, replaced by winding, labyrinthine passages that seemed to stretch into infinity. The whispers started again, faint and distant, but growing steadily louder. I ran. The shelves closed in around me, the air growing colder with each step. No matter how far I went, the library stretched on, its endless corridors twisting and looping back on themselves. The whispers were everywhere now, rising to a cacophony that drowned out my own panicked breaths. And then I saw it. Ahead of me, a door stood ajar, its outline glowing faintly in the oppressive gloom. I didn't want to go through it, but I had no other choice. The whispers pushed me forward, their voices merging into a single, commanding tone. The room beyond was identical to the one I'd first found behind the hidden door. The shelves, the table, the grotesque illustrations, it was all the same. But this time I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing in the center of the room. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but the weight of its presence was suffocating. On the table lay the book, its cover once again pristine. The title had changed. It read, "Your Story." I took a step closer, my hands trembling as I reached for the book. The figure didn't stop me, but its shadow loomed larger, darker, stretching across the walls and ceiling until it seemed to swallow the room. As I opened the book, I saw the pages filling themselves, the words and illustrations forming before my eyes. It was my life, every moment, every thought, every fear. The final page wasn't an illustration this time. It was a single sentence, written in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow knew the meaning of. "You cannot leave." The figure moved then, its elongated hand reaching for me. The light in the room dimmed, the shadows closing in, and the whispers turned to screams. I knew, deep down, that I would never leave the library again.